And he also worked with McNamara on Vietnam issues. But because he was Daniel Ellsberg and always wanted to be doing the most useful, perhaps the most dramatic thing, he asked to go to Vietnam. And he certainly didn't have to go to Vietnam because he was working, in the Defense Department. So he goes to Vietnam and he spends a tremendous amount of time, I think he was there for about 18 months, going out with U.S. troops into various, operations, seeing what's going on the ground, and increasingly becomes really horrified by what he's seeing. And not only horrified morally, in terms of the damage that he thinks is being done to the people of Vietnam, he's also horrified intellectually because he thinks, as he starts looking at the situation in Vietnam, he says, this is crazy. We're never going to prevail in Vietnam. It's not going to happen. But nevertheless, he goes back to Washington. He doesn't quit. And he continues to work for McNamara. And one of the things at the very end of McNamara's time as Secretary of Defense, and again, I've had this discussion in my class, if you were in college in 1965, which none of you are, Robert McNamara is a household name. You wouldn't not know Robert McNamara because he's the face of the Vietnam War. He's the guy that's always out there talking to the press, insisting everything is being done in the proper way and everything's going really well. That's Robert McNamara. By the end of his time as Secretary of Defense, so this would have been probably 66, 67, 67 more, Robert McNamara actually concludes that this war is a terrible mistake. It's kind of a big mistake, but by the time he concludes that, there's 35,000 Americans that are dead and about 1 million Asians, if not more, that have already been killed. And he goes from being this super cheerleader for the war to really, he's a wreck. I mean, a lot of people say he had a nervous breakdown. He, went in to see Lyndon Johnson at one point. This is McNamara, with his blood on my hands. I mean, it's this unbelievable story. But in any case, one of the things that McNamara does is he commissions a secret study. And what the point of the study was to understand how the U.S. government had made such stupid mistakes, right? Because we've been involved in Vietnam since 1948, 49. So this is a secret study, and they get thousands of documents that are dredged up, and there's a narrative that's written. And Daniel Ellsberg is part of that process, so he knows what's in that study. And the study is pretty damning for a number of reasons, and I'll just mention two of them, which is, number one, the extent to which the Kennedy and Johnson administrations were deliberately lying to the American public about the nature of our involvement there. So there's a lot of material on that. There's also a lot of material in the Pentagon Papers which make it kind of clear that this operation is not looking very successful all along. You didn't have to get to 1968 to have that dawn on you. There's a lot of info that's coming in about, no, this is probably not going to work, or it's very iffy, but still they pursued it. So it's very damaging. However, it's top secret. It's filed away. Robert McNamara does nothing with it, etc. So then we move to the Nixon years, which I've written 500 pages about, which I really encourage you to read every one of. But I'm going to simplify it by saying that when the Nixon administration is continuing the war, now Ellsberg is in private life. And but he's working for the Rand Corporation, so he still has access to highly classified material. And he increasingly feels that just as it had been his responsibility to help the Kennedy administration wage the Cold War and responsible to fight the Cold War by joining the military, he now feels it is his responsibility to stop the war. And he believes that if those Pentagon Papers could be known to the American public, that would really be very significant to people. People would be furious and it would end the war. So he began, this is a huge thing, and he begins Xeroxing like crazy, secretly, all of these documents. And he involves his 10-year-old son in this activity, which his ex-wife never was so happy about that. But Ellsberg was figuring he was going to end up spending the rest of his life in jail. And so he wanted his son to have some understanding of what was happening. So he and this 11-year-old, for months, are copying all these documents, which are known as the Pentagon Papers. Now, I don't know if, does that ring any bell? How many of you have heard of the Pentagon Papers? So a bit more. So that's what they were. They were a narrative history and a ton of top secret documents that reflected poorly on the whole policy. And so Ellsberg basically decides that he is going to make this available to the public. And he tries initially to get members of Congress to disclose it, but they're all scared to do it. It's top secret material. They're worried they're going to get, thrown in jail like Ellsberg. But finally, he convinces a reporter for the New York Times, Neil Sheehan, to take these documents, and the New York Times decides to publish those documents, which is a huge, or at least publish a lot of them. So that starts to happen. So that is bringing you into the summer of 1971. And the New York Times starts publishing. The Nixon administration decides that this is a terrible precedent of people just leaking secret documents. Henry Kissinger, who's the national security advisor at that point, he's really mad because Ellsberg had been his student at Harvard. And not only that, but he had used Ellsberg as a consultant on various matters, including even at the beginning of their time in office. He had Ellsberg as a consultant. So Kissinger feels really, implicated in all this. So in the White House, they go ballistic about it. And immediately there's a search, like who did it? Who's the person that leaked it? However, pretty quickly, they find out that it's Daniel Ellsberg. I mean, he had gone into hiding, but very inadequate hiding. And so he emerges, and he is charged, he and his another partner, Richard Russo, they're charged with crimes that would have them in jail, each of them for 101 years. So it looks like he's going to go to jail, and they're going to throw the key away. But when he's caught, he's not contrite. And he takes advantage of being caught and all this publicity to use that as the opportunity to say to people how absolutely crazy this war is. The tremendous damage that's being done to people in Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam and to our own soldiers and the cost that we're paying at home. He uses that platform. But even as he appears and makes these kinds of statements, it just makes Nixon and Kissinger madder and madder. So one of the things that happens is that they set up, so Ellsberg's arrested. He's out on bail for a while. They set up an entity called the Plumbers. Now, does that ring any bells? So the idea of the Plumbers is going to be to get dirt on Ellsberg. Right, so you just get dirt on Ellsberg. And I guess the other thing I didn't say, which is pretty important in all of this story, is they issue an order to the New York Times to desist publishing those papers. And as soon as that happens, other newspapers around the country, the Washington Post, the St. Louis Dispatch, the Chicago Tribune, I think, they start picking it up. So the Times is initially muzzled. These other papers are going. It's a huge freedom of the press issue. And in fact, the Supreme Court, in a very important decision, says that these papers were right to publish this information, that it was the public's right to know that. So that's a very historic thing. But meanwhile, they're out like trying to find dirt on Ellsberg. And that's all, like, if you were living through that time, you had no idea that that was happening, that they were out trying to get dirt on Ellsberg. Okay, it was just, that was happening, but you didn't really know it. You just knew that Daniel Ellsberg was, like, looking at a life in jail, basically. And again, he never apologizes. He always says, I did it because I am a loyal American. I have a responsibility to the public and to the people of the world that if some great wrong is being committed, I need to speak up about that. And this may be the legacy of his father falling asleep at the wheel. I was thinking about that today. But anyway, he's very impressive. He's a very electric figure, really, at that time. To see him, he's very inspirational for people. In any event, they're looking for dirt, and I'm going to now fast forward really quickly, which is that one of the things that happens, probably most of you have heard about Watergate and the break-in to the Democratic headquarters, and you probably know that Richard Nixon tried to undermine the investigation. He interfered, he obstructed law enforcement on who broke into the Democratic headquarters. And that was a question, like, why? Why would you go to all that trouble? But one of the reasons that Nixon covered it up is it was brought to his attention by his people, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, that these people who had broken into the Democratic headquarters were unfortunately the same people who had broken into the psychiatrist of Daniel Ellsberg, psychiatrist, in an effort to get files that would have damaging information. So when that came out, that was like a huge, you can just imagine, that was like a bombshell. And then it turned out that one of Nixon's people had consulted the judge in the case and offered the judge a job. So, and there were other things that came out. So the net effect was that, contrary to Ellsberg's idea that he was going to be in jail for the rest of his life, the judge says mistrial, that government misconduct means that he cannot receive a fair trial. So despite everybody's expectation, Daniel Ellsberg walks away from all of this a free man, not spending the rest of his life in jail. Now, at that point, you might feel, well, okay, I'm Daniel Ellsberg. I did all this, was pretty scary. Obviously, if you're facing 101 years in prison, you're not like the happiest person there ever was. But Ellsberg continues long after that to play an important role as a kind of whistleblower, taking the knowledge that he had gained when he was an insider, the knowledge he gained about U.S. military policy, about U.S. nuclear policy, and using that knowledge so that in one way or another he devotes himself to educating the American public about what their government is doing. And he did that for the remainder of his adult life. And one of the areas where he was especially outspoken, and this brings us to today, is in the area of nuclear weapons. Because from his experience as an insider, not, some professor someplace, imagining this or that, he was acutely aware of the approach of government to nuclear weapons, and he was acutely aware of the many ways in which the possession of huge nuclear arsenals by us, by the Russians, later by other countries, how dangerous this really was. And for those of you who are in my class on the Cuban Missile Crisis, you know that was a moment that was very dangerous and Americans really knew it. But part of what Ellsberg was thinking is that, okay, that was very clear, it was very dramatic, the public understood it. But in fact, the public doesn't understand how dangerous these nuclear arsenals really are. And so he devoted much of his life to going around and talking about those issues. And that brings me, up to the present, he was omnipresent, writing things, speaking, meeting with college students, etc. And he was then like 90 years old. Now some people when they're 90, they sort of say, okay, I did what I was supposed to do. I'm not going to Florida, I'm going to sit there. He didn't really decide that. He stayed active. And then he got a diagnosis that he had cancer, and that the cancer was very advanced. And so, when that happens to people, as many of you probably know from one sad situation or another, people really react very, very differently to this news. But Daniel Ellsberg is Daniel Ellsberg. So what does he do? So he writes a letter to his friends. And I'm actually one of his friends, and that's not very exciting news because he has 10,000 friends. You have to understand, 10,000 people around the country that are getting his correspondence all the time. So he writes to his friends, and 10,000 of us, and he says he's been told that he has incurable cancer, that chemotherapy is not going to extend his life that much, that he's decided to stop chemotherapy. Partly because he then thought he could eat all the foods that the doctors hadn't let him eat for all those years before, so that was okay. But he was going to stop chemotherapy, and he was going to spend every minute of his surviving life going around and educating people about the danger of nuclear weapons. And this becomes very acute for him because of what's happening in Ukraine. And his concern that even though a lot of Americans just turned it out, like, oh, I can't think about Ukraine, I have to, buy groceries, that he came to the conclusion the situation in Ukraine and the intersection of that with nuclear weapons was really serious, and people really needed to understand it. So he decided that he was going to use all of his time to try to communicate that. So that's what you're going to see today. And I just looked at that film yesterday. I hadn't seen it. It's just a section of it's like 40 minutes, but you're going to see about 11 minutes. So I was looking, I hadn't seen it. And I was very shocked. First of all, the old Daniel Ellsberg was a firebrand. Like, you would never fall asleep when he was talking, ever. But this is, when you look at it, you're going to say, oh, it's kind of, it's drony. He sounds a little boring. I want to encourage you to think about this in a different way, okay? So if you have that reaction, I can definitely understand it. But think of it as a 90-year-old man who is looking out at the world, who's looking at U.S. policy, who's looking at Ukraine and the return of the Cold War with great dread, and he wants to alert people to the danger of that. So you're seeing a very old man, but until probably 2 days before he died, he never stopped trying to bring that news to people of America. So as you watch it, understand what you're seeing. You're seeing a 90-year-old guy talking about something that he thinks, and I think we think, is pretty important. Thank you.
Do I need to do something to make this happen?
I should say while we're waiting, that Daniel Ellsberg was on his campus many times.
There's supposed to be a clip
It's not a stranger to the
that we had up
When I
before,
first heard him
but
here
it's
24
turned off
years
now,
ago,
so
he
maybe
was, a dynamic,
that's it.
impressive. So here he is at 90.
The Russian invasion of Ukraine has made the world unsuccessful and dangerous wars. So we're seeing here humanity at its almost worst. Not quite the worst, fortunately. And to go over this whole period of what we've been talking about, we haven't seen the worst. We've avoided the worst. And I say we, I'll give credit even to the leaders at their near worst. We haven't seen nuclear war. And really, that was unexpected. When I was in my teens, in the 40s or the 50s or early 60s, I think almost nobody that I knew expected that we would go 70 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki without another explosion on humans. And that could well have happened. We've been very close to it, discreditably close to it. And yet, something happened that was not easily foreseeable then. Each of the superpowers, US and Russia, allowed themselves to be stalemated or defeated without reverting to nuclear weapons. I think almost nobody really foresaw that possibility. And of course, it's a possibility now, but there is this difference. In each of those cases, there was a stalemate confronting such a smaller power, whether it was Korea or Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, or the Russians in Afghanistan, even though their opponents were supplied by the superpower, by their adversary superpowers, and it was something of a proxy war. Nevertheless, we were able to accept really defeat in Vietnam, defeat in Afghanistan. without using nuclear weapons, although they were considered at various points. Something of essentially a defeat in Iraq, politically speaking, the Russians in Afghanistan, and so forth. So that could persist unless we know the history of that period and know how close actually there was consideration of escalating to nuclear war. That is currently a more imminent possibility than the world has seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, 60 years ago. Actually, there was a very close, and for similar reasons, possibility of nuclear war in 1983, 20 years later, that most of the people don't know of, but it's a time when the Russians, the Soviets then, felt under possible imminent attack, and were preparing very dangerously, foolishly, but as we would have done in similar circumstances, for a preemptive attack against the United States. And there were false alarms during that crisis that could well have triggered it, except for the prudence of individuals in the system, so that the world hung on the somewhat dangerous, in career terms, decisions by people like Arkhipov in the Cuban Missile Crisis and Colonel Petrov in the 1983 crisis, not to alarm their superiors with their own belief that there might well be an imminent attack. That could occur in the current crisis and in various ways. For example, if the Ukrainians were to use the missile systems that we're now giving them, which have the capability of replying to Russian attacks on Ukrainian soil, with Ukrainian attacks on Russian soil, that would be a severe escalation, possibly out of our control. That happened again if a possible defeat in the Donbass of Russian forces caused Putin and or his commanders, or conceivably subordinates, to attack supply points in Poland, thus implicating NATO directly in this. We would get into a NATO-US war, which has so far been avoided. I'm saying that each power here, Biden on the one hand and Putin on the other, have, as in the past, refrained from acts that would bring us into direct armed conflict together, have shown a kind of prudence that we've seen before, and yet they're gambling with a clear-cut risk by what they're doing and the other side is doing by the interaction of getting into something that has not happened in the 70 years, and that is totally so far new. And that is the imminent possibility of armed conflict between the US or NATO and Russia or the Soviet Union earlier. Amazingly, in these 70 years, you might say, each side has taken care, even in a proxy war, in each case against some asymmetric, against some weaker power, has taken care to avoid direct armed conflict between the two. So something we have not seen yet tested is the willingness of a superpower leader to lose or be defeated, or stalemated, I should say, by the other superpower, because that involves a loss of prestige and a loss of influence in the world that has not occurred in these earlier wars. For the U.S. to withdraw from Vietnam or Afghanistan is understood by others as not directly impinging on their ability to be a great power or a superpower in the world. Other targets on this. That's absurd. That would not be achieved in 100 years. So they are both talking about very long wars. And as this war goes on, the possibility of escalation then continues, even grows, to avoid escalation or to avoid stalemate, a costly stalemate, and escalation. So the chance of a negotiated outcome to this, which I think is ideally would happen as soon as possible, or at least within the next several months, and I'll come back to that, is very important, but it's not likely. as I say, the arguments I'm arguing against are at the very top of our leadership. And Putin has said similar things, as has Zelensky, changing an earlier position in which he allowed the possibility of a negotiated outcome which would give up some sovereignty over the Donbass and over, for at least a long period of years, Crimea, along with neutrality and a willingness not to have any American bases or foreign bases on its soil. Earlier, he expressed an interest in that and then has switched that in recent times and is now talking about what amounts to a determination to fight on until Russian soldiers have left the Donbass, the eastern Ukraine, where they've been for 8 years, and Crimea, which they have annexed, and which it's extremely unlikely that they will give up control of that. So we're talking about a long war in which Ukrainian lives are destroyed enormously. Hundreds of thousands more casualties on the Ukrainian side, as well as comparably on the Russian side. Now, a terrific problem here in confronting this tragic situation for Ukraine, and for that matter, for the Russian people with the sanctions, and the rest of the world in terms of food supplies from Ukraine, which confronts people in Africa right now with a threat of famine and starvation as this goes on. A real obstacle to that is that there are definite benefits and preferences in favor of a long war on both sides. The fact is that a stalemated war and even a lost war, as in Vietnam or Afghanistan or significantly in Iraq, is very profitable for the people who provide arms. And they are not marginal corporations here. These are quite influential corporations on our side, and very possibly comparably on the Russian side as well. But here, Raytheon, Lockheed, Boeing, Northrop Grumman making the new ICBMs, and General Dynamics are profiting hugely. Their stock has gone up, and reasonably so. If you have no scruples as to what you're investing in, Lockheed is a very good investment at this point, because, and Raytheon, supplying the Stingers and the Javelins and many of the other weapons of war here. I think from their point of view, this war can't last too long. Quite fine with them for it to go on indefinitely. And from the U.S. government point of view, this Russian aggression has resuscitated NATO, which is Cosa Nostra, our thing for the American protectorate, the protection racket that we have run in NATO for a long time. It has resuscitated the U.S. role in Europe, dominance, even enlarged NATO, and, as I say, created a Cold War atmosphere in which U.S. leadership, even in Asia, is now greatly enhanced. And that, again, can't go on too long. On the Russian side, we're running into a very common, and this applies to the U.S. as well, but more to the Russian side, the chance of an actual prestigious loss, a humiliating loss, is what confronts Putin right now. And all our history, which I've been analyzing as best I could in the last half century, having participated in some of the worst aspects of it before that, tells me that rather than suffer that humiliating cost, a leader in a position of Putin is willing to raise the ante, escalate, back up previous failures, double down in ways that are without consideration of the humans, like the Ukrainians in this case, Afghans, in the case both of the Soviet invasion and the U.S. invasion and elsewhere, with very little consideration of them, just doesn't come in. I've said that the Russian aggression and the understandable and supportable, I would support, resistance to that in the way of arms aid and position without direct conflict by the U.S. Has some very serious impact on proliferation, on money, on starvation right now. The worst of all, I think, is the destruction of the possibility of the kind of collaboration, cooperation, common security that's between the U.S., China, India, Russia, that is essential for dealing with the great existential problem facing civilization now, the climate catastrophe that's looming before us. Let me be very specific. This war in the last few months, I think, has ruled out the possibility of keeping a ceiling on global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. That was the goal of past global summits on this subject, supposedly 1.5, then elevated possibly to 2, each of which represented very bad degradations of the world environment for humans. That's going to happen now. I think the possibility, that's my best judgment as I've tried to inform myself on this. The kind of cooperation we need with China specifically, the two greatest emitters now in the world, the US and China, seems extremely unlikely. If somehow that could change, China could change its relation to Russia on this, that would be very good. But that is not the way events are going. And without that collaboration, climate, the world is going to get hotter in ways of producing floods, hurricanes, rising sea levels, toxicity in the ocean, of disastrous effects for civilization. Not extinction, just a world much less favorable to human existence. And that, I think, is going to be very hard to change. That's a catastrophe right now. It's tragic, as I see. Finally, the prospects for simply continuing at this level, even without escalation, this high level, I think make that the most likely course of events that I see coming up, and disastrously so. All experience of the past that I've studied and participated in says that men in power, and it's usually men, occasionally women, it applies to them too, if they're in power, will risk and even sacrifice almost any number of humans to avoid a short-run, almost certain disaster for them personally, and a setback, a defeat, a humiliation, which would cause them to lose office and to lose power and whatnot. And rather than do that, their incentives are to pursue possibilities of avoiding that, of staying in office, of avoiding the defeat at the cost of stalemate as the alternative, or even, very unlikely, victory. But either of those with the risk or high likelihood of enormous loss of life, almost without limit. And I say that because of my knowledge of the nuclear plans. The risk both sides are taking of a possible nuclear war now, disastrous nuclear war, even if it remained somewhat limited, still disastrous. The possibility of the ultimate catastrophe of nuclear winter is consciously being preserved, not reduced, if anything increased, by the actions of each side. Could be worse. They could be, at this moment or tomorrow, attacking each side, Poland, Russia, NATO. Tactical nuclear weapons are definitely a possibility, each of which raises still higher, to a very high point, the possibility of all-out war between the US and Russia.
Again, bleak, challenging. Think about that, the power of this mind, though, that he is 90 years old, still envisioning, trying to think about how we might solve this immediate Ukrainian problem. It's extraordinary that this relentless and brilliant mind is still passionately, as Professor Eisenberg mentioned, committed to what can be done to make this world better, to save this world. I love the quote, some of you know, by Gramsci, where he says, what we have to have is pessimism of the mind, but optimism of the will. And there's no better embodiment, I think, of that combination than Daniel Ellsberg. You know, he's facing these brutal realities that are necessary to face, however unpleasant, however challenging, however existentially, you know, disconcerting they are. And yet, this is someone who spent all of his life, you know, trying to face that reality and trying to do something about it. So I think we have to take both inspiration from his extraordinary critique and courage in facing, pessimistically perhaps, but I think by that he means realistically, what's going on, and at the same time the, you know, relentlessness of his efforts and his activism and his speaking truth to power and walking the talk that's involved in speaking that truth. So in any case, comments, questions, you know, I think so often the challenge is that we all feel a bit overwhelmed by what's going on in the world, right? And the levels of denial, particularly perhaps in American culture, you know, where we distract ourselves very often from what's going on. But again, it's important to balance the reality and facing that reality with the sense of empowerment and hopefully inspiration, that there are things that can be done, there are things that are being done. He's not the only whistleblower and courageous elderly activist in the world, but I think his concern and his appeal is really to all of you, you know, as a younger generation, what can be done despite the challenges and the difficulties. So we're curious to hear from you guys. What do you think? Is this just too bleak? Is it, why is it that it's so hard to face these realities? I mean, today we're, you know, this with the war on woke, it's not even good to be too aware, apparently, of these things. But we're curious to see what inspires you, how you feel about the future. This is not something that's, again, shouldn't be, at least, just depressing. This is what the human condition is kind of about, how we face these challenges. Some of you know, another one of my favorite quotes is by Camus, who talked about, you know, the myth of Sisyphus. Did you all read that when you were in, at some point? Where, you know, Sisyphus has to push the rock up the hill, and he gets up the hill and splat rolls down on him. And, you know, there's two responses, right? You can either say, I'm no fool, it's impossible to deal with this nuclear dilemma or Ukraine or the Middle East or any of these other enormously challenging problems in our own country about mass incarceration and so many issues that need to be tackled. And then, of course, the biggest and baddest, which he mentions, which is the environmental catastrophe. But Camus says, okay, you can do two things. You can either say, this is just too awful, and I'm no fool. I know what's, you know, there's not really getting the rock up the hill. It's not going to happen. So we can get depressed, which we certainly all understand, those moments. On the other hand, he said the other pathology, this is Camus now, is that we can get sort of schizophrenic about things and deny the reality of the world, right? Let's just rock and roll till the end comes, right? Or if the apocalypse is inevitable, or as he said, this dramatic change in the human condition, the human possibility. You know, we can just all kind of do what we want to do until the end comes. That's also pathological, Camus would argue. And so his argument is, some of you may know this if you've read Myth of Sisyphus, it's in a way it's like love the rock, right? We have to be human is to be fully engaged in this struggle. This is what it means to be a human being, for better and for worse. And I think that again, Ellsberg embodies that, the relentlessness of the struggle, the courage to face the reality, despite all attempts to either obscure it or to succumb to it. And I think that's maybe harder here than anywhere. Maybe I'm wrong. I think it's harder here because we're a very hyper-individualistic society. So the rock is definitely not going to be pushed up the hill by one individual. And so I think that's the other legacy of Ellsberg that I think is so important. He knew how to work with other people despite his own strong will and opinions. And of course, I think that's one of the things that's so important for all of us is to realize that. Questions, comments from all of you? Again, these are tough issues, big stakes, but important to think about. What would be one thing that could happen that would move some of this forward? We can't just, as I say, sort of succumb to despair, and we can't just deny these realities. But I'd be curious to see what would it take to make a difference on these issues. Anyone? Yes, please. Do you mind going to the mic? Is that possible? Really appreciate it. Is it on? It should be on. Tap it again and see.
No.
No.
It is.
Is there a button on it?
Check. There you go.
Got it. Great. You've done that before, haven't you? No. Okay.
I just wanted to say I find it fascinating how, he did work for the government at one point and how he almost felt there were inhumane actions being done and that he almost had to take a stand against the whole government and almost like get the papers and information published to the public so that the public could, overwhelm the government, because at the end of the day, the public is what is, I guess, what makes up the job of the government. The government is, providing for the public. So if they do see something, unjust or something that's wrong, the government's job is to, I guess, provide a solution for the public. And how they saw with, I believe, the Vietnam War, how, crazy things were being done and the public wasn't aware of it. I just find it astounding how he was able to, just bring up that information without, I guess, having the fear of, what's going to happen to him.
Yeah.
And, going to jail for like 101 years. Yeah. But yeah, that's it.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, earlier today, some of you, I don't think any of you were here for our 11:20 session, but we had an interesting guy named Ray McGovern, who also had been, an ultimate insider, who then becomes an outsider, a critic of the government because of what he learned, because of what he saw. And he had been a CIA analyst for 27 years and then started to say, this is, I don't want to be a part of this. In fact, McGovern had even gotten a commendation, a big medal, and he turned it back 6 years later when the CIA was found to be involved in torture. He said, I don't want a commendation from an organization that, that tortures people. And so the point you're raising is such an important one. What is that process of awakening or coming to see? And again, out of all good motives, he, as Professor Eisenberg was pointing out, he had been serving his country. He had been wanting to make things better, wanting to solve problems for the sake of the people that the government is supposed to represent, as you mentioned. And so that process, which again is, as you point out, it's a tough one. That's a pretty complex journey to be fully invested in something and then to change your mind, right? I suspect, well, college is about changing your mind very often, but we've all had something of that experience, I'm assuming, where something that you thought was the case, and then you discover, as you know more, learn more, talk to others, those assumptions, those orthodoxies are challenged by what you know and what you learn. And that's not an easy thing to do, to change one's mind, right? And to see particularly the more invested you are in something, like the career, like the job, like the institutional biases. And so, yeah, he's an extraordinary person who's able to do that. But again, as that poem pointed out, to not do that became even worse, right, for him, because he was a person of conscience, of integrity, of rationality. And so to be able to do that, to step outside of the familiar, the known, the easier, the predictable, the self-interested, to go beyond one's self-interest is really rather extraordinary. And again, I think that's why we, however one may disagree about some of his opinions, that's my definition of a human being, right? Professor Malkonian.
Yeah. One of the things that I think Ellsberg referred to was that, I'm not sure he said this explicitly, but from what I got from the film is that the Russians have their story and the Ukrainians and the Americans have their story, but that this is a relatively micro problem compared to the overall problem of the existential threats we're facing with nuclear weapons and with climate change. So I'm wondering how students feel about this, that is there a way in which we can say some issues we can dispute about, but there are some things that are beyond that, that perhaps this is a way we can begin to rethink and maybe want to look at a bigger picture rather than the micro picture of who's right or wrong on the Ukraine question. Wondering if there were any commentary on that.
A lot of it's about respect for the other narrative, isn't it? Being able to understand the point of view of, of the other, particularly when it's a very consolidated paradigm where people are very invested in their narrative. We see this certainly in the Middle East right now, of course, too. Other comments, questions, inspiration? Again, I know all of these issues are rather overwhelming when you think about particularly climate, I think, as he points out. Again, I'm so impressed that he's got his hand on the pulse of things right now. This is a 90-year-old man. Maybe I'll be so good at 90. And yet he is also so intensely aware of and concerned about and passionate about what lies ahead, and passionate about you guys, right? This is, his story, his biography is now over, but he's very concerned about the next generation, generations to come. And even when he's talking, go ahead.
Well, I don't want to interrupt.
No, I'm just.
I'm just sitting here thinking about this, and I'm kind of thinking about in terms of generation.
Yeah.
That, Linda and I and Marty, we're not actually all the exact same age, but we're coming from a somewhat different generation, and I'm sort of trying to,
Rusty, can we have you talk into the mic? Thank you so much.
So I'm just sitting here and thinking about the generations and what is the same and what is different. So I want to make one other point about Ellsberg that I forgot to make, and then come back to what we're talking about right now. The point I would make about Ellsberg is that his action in releasing the Pentagon Papers had a practical effect, that it wasn't the only thing going on, but those papers helped to turn millions of Americans who were maybe on the fence about the war in Vietnam. It actually, helped people to really feel more certain about the necessity to get out. And that feeling and that change in public opinion, which was really going on in 1971, ultimately meant that the United States left Vietnam. That if people hadn't been active and speaking up and doing things and taking risks, that war would have continued much longer and with even more suffering than had happened. So I really want to emphasize that, it's not just that he's doing this act, but that it actually had an effect. Right. It also had an effect on something else, which I'm going to totally simplify by saying that the combination of the fact that these plumbers were pillaging his papers, and then Richard Nixon had to help cover up the plumbers, actually led Richard Nixon to be impeached. Yeah. Right? That there was a sequence of events that had that effect. I don't think that Ellsberg, when he did what he did, thought, I'm going to get Richard Nixon impeached. But in fact, it was part of a chain of events that had that effect. So I just wanted to mention that. But I want to switch a little bit. Like, I'm sitting here thinking, like, what about Ellsberg? Like, why did he do what he did? What did it mean? And one thing about Ellsberg, and I don't know how many of us really feel the way Ellsberg did. Ellsberg did feel like he was an effective person. Like, he really believed that till the minute that he died, that what he did would make a real difference. Not change the whole world, but that it would make a big difference. And that, I don't know how many of us sitting in this room feel that way now about things, that, if we just did X, it would really have an impact. The other thing I was thinking about Ellsberg, so there's his own personal sense that he could matter, that his ideas would matter, his behavior would matter. The other thing that hasn't been said is that there was a political movement. It wasn't like Daniel Ellsberg out there, fighting the elements, right? This was at a time in American history where, literally hundreds of thousands of people were also acting on some of these issues. So that's an important frame as well, for him to think, well, if I do something, if I take a stand, even if I have to go to jail, there's a whole world out here where it really is going to reverberate and really make a big difference. So I'm very conscious of that. I'm thinking of, how do people feel now? Is that present? Is that feeling of effectiveness there? Or if not, what would it take to make that happen, right? I mean, as a professor, I'm very conscious of the fact that we have like these multiplying crises, right? I mean, as of this morning. Right? I mean, we have a political crisis in our country right now, including the fact that the House of Representatives can't even meet because they can't agree on a speaker, so they're going home. So we have that crisis, and we have the situation in Ukraine with the associated nuclear danger, and we have this horrific situation in the Middle East. I mean, there's a lot of really troubling things that are piling up and that are really challenging. I'm thinking, but we can't just say, okay, well, it's really bad, I don't want to know about it. But how do we find a space for us as individual people to do something that's constructive? Like, how do we find our footing to do that? And the lessons of 1970 are not the lessons of now. They're really, I think the challenges are different. So I don't know if that adds to a good mood.
It's great. It's great. I'm wondering if, though, I could oh, great. Somebody wants to talk. Any other response? Thanks, Rusty. Other comments, reactions, suggestions, inspirations? Very important. I would disagree a tiny bit, though, with what Dr. Eisenberg was saying, in that, Ellsberg was a historical individual, and he did have this enormous impact on our country, on the world, in fact. But I think often it's less sung heroes. There are often smaller actions where we kind of live in a culture where we glorify the great individual. And it's not that we shouldn't, but I think sometimes it's more modest actions because often we say, well, I'm not an Ellsberg, I'm not a Gandhi, I'm not a Martin Luther King Jr. I don't have that courage, that capacity. And as she said, there have to be critical social movements there as well. It's not just an individual. It's not the Rocky syndrome, where you have one great individual. It requires that there be community and struggles and, as I say, critical social movements. But it's often not, it's sometimes more modest, because I think when we see this huge gap between someone like an Ellsberg, who sacrificed everything, we think, well, that can't be me, that can't be us, right? And so I think we also have to have an appreciation for the smaller acts of quiet heroism, if you want to call it that, or quiet struggle that is more collective, that is more, not as great and grand and courageous, perhaps. Because I think if that's the standard, we often say, well, why bother? What can little old me do in the face of these extraordinary challenges and difficulties and existential crises of the human species, right? And as I say, I think particularly perhaps in America, where we are, to our great strength, but also perhaps to our great weakness, that we are so individualistic often, that the realization that we need to work together, we need to struggle together, we need to build together, is sometimes harder found or harder to get to. So I think, when we maybe that's part of the dilemma. I mean, you tell us that these seem like such enormous tasks that require not just heroes, but superheroes in order to accomplish. And that's perhaps an unrealistic standard for us, or maybe that's the way we feel. But I think that we also have to acknowledge the quieter acts of heroism. One of the things that I thought was a potentially constructive thing about the pandemic was a hopeful appreciation for all kinds of other essential work that was not acknowledged as superheroic before. The things that kind of keep life moving, and that are more, that are less appreciated often, that are perhaps more sacrificial than grandiose. And so I think we've regressed since then, unfortunately, but there at least was in that moment, I think, a greater appreciation for solidarity, for community, for contributing in ways that were meaningful and yet not so, hyperbolically individualistic. But I don't know, we seem to have regressed since then, or have we? I don't know. In any case, I think in all of these ways, it's important to see what can be done, in both small and grand ways, right? In ways that are both incremental, perhaps, as well as transformative. No other insights, questions, reactions to share? Are you completely bleakly depressed by this? Any other wisdom or sharing on this? Yes, please.
All right, this conversation kind of makes me reflect on where one goes to find the truth. Right, so this is something you debate in philosophy classes and so on and so forth. But there was a time that, if you're an undergraduate, maybe difficult to remember, or you can't remember it at all, or you don't get any insight on it, where if you wanted the truth or something close to it, you went to some written publication, a journal, a quality newspaper, something of that nature. And the assumption was that if someone could write in that kind of a space, that there was some reasonable assumption that they had qualifications to be able to do so. And so that you could probably unravel the truth if you read one position from a farther right publication, one from a farther left publication, something more centrist, and so on. Now, and I feel very unfortunate that this is true for what you have, what we all have, if we want to get some source of information, where do we go? To the internet. So the internet is a great asset on the one hand, and a tremendous liability on the other, because it's almost impossible to find the truth there. Why? Because any, excuse the term, jerk can put something on the internet, have it go out over maybe the whole world, and the assumption is that if he or she wrote it, it must be true, at least for a lot of the population. Hopefully one that hasn't been or has been, maybe not for someone who's been taught to think critically, like hopefully most of you have. But, and that's where conspiracy theories arise, because conspiracy theories are very easy to believe because they're simple and people seek simplicity for explanations for all of the complex things that we see today. But on the other hand, it's almost very hard to find, because an awful lot of what's written on the internet, there's no quality at all, and the qualifications for one being able to write that are nothing, because there are no editors. There's nobody passing on what the quality of the argument is. Makes me kind of sad for everybody who's here.
Yeah, and I think you're right that the media and the difficulty of figuring out what's going on and sorting out, if not truth with the big T, at least a variety of narratives that can be assessed and for which there can be evidence, et cetera. I think you pointed yourself to one of the key features, which is critical thinking. I always tell people, if you get nothing out of college except critical thinking, we'll be really, really happy, because that is one of the key things, to be able to question, to be able to distill from the mess of the internet and social media and all of these diverse opinions, most of whom, many of which, as you point out, are erroneous, false, intentionally wrong. So no, that is a big part of the issue, is sorting out what's going on. How can we know what's happening? How can we, face these realities that Ellsberg's talking about, if there is such a mess of opinions that are wrong, that make this so difficult. Who was it that talked about the post-factual reality that we're in? It used to be, as you were pointing out, and as this morning's speaker pointed out, that you could say, here are the facts. Right? We're not going to just interpret them. Now, granted, there's always some interpretation with what facts are there and how they're presented. But now, that almost is secondary, it seems. What are those facts? What is that evidence? Because of the mess, the big soup that we find ourselves in. So this is a huge problem. One hopes that all of you have a degree of media literacy that helps you, focus on and sort out and distill what's accurate from what's not. But even so, this is a big challenge. This is a big problem. Any other questions or comments? Professor Jensen?
Yeah, just a couple of small things, or maybe not so small. One, I think it would be great if you, who are kind of veterans of the peace movement, would share maybe some links with us. I can share it with my class, which is Cultural Globalization, just in case any students wants to get involved with the peace movement, or more concretely, maybe against nuclear proliferation initiatives in that regard. Any such sources would be welcome. Lots
of stuff that can be provided right here on campus. I would start with where you are usually, and that's right here on campus. We have our Center for Civic Engagement, and part of that is called the Institute for Peace Studies. In fact, I referenced earlier the Peace and Conflict Studies program, which is part of the sponsoring of this event. So I think that often the process is start close to home. Start with what's there. Granted, these are global issues, huge issues, but even, for example, the biggest of them, the environment, are things that can be done right here on campus. But we can certainly do that. It's a great idea. We should maybe have a list of links and
that'd be great.
Things.
Thank you. And my second point is, I just really hope that we will. I think we are so many people who are aching these days because of all the terrible things that are happening in the world, and some of us have family and friends here and there. Whether it's Ukraine or Russia, Middle East, and the different parts of the Middle East. I'm just really hoping that instead of just sitting by ourselves and being depressed and going online and keep creating these echo chambers online of like-minded people, that we really take this opportunity that we have. You young people, you have these 4 years in college, and maybe this is your best opportunity to really hang out with some people of different backgrounds than yourself, So just take that opportunity, and I think we should take that opportunity too as professors to facilitate for us where we can meet and just be together and try to share this feeling of despair that we have and just condemn terrorism wherever that terrorism is coming from and wherever it's happening, and create that feeling of solidarity and sympathy with each other.
That's I couldn't agree with you more.
So and also I think it's important that we remind our students that we are also interested in helping you guys if you want to start clubs or whatever it is. So we do have many good clubs on campus already, but do we really have, and I don't know the answer to this, but do we really have, for example, a club for intercultural conversations or something like that, or maybe we need to just collect or gather many different clubs together and have these sorts of supportive conversations across these very artificial divides that we tend to create between us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kari. That's the spirit of what's needed. It really does, and Professor Eisenberg may not be happy with me asking her to do this, but I think a lot of it does boil down to empathy, right? And we are in a sort of crisis of empathy. Some of that is empathy fatigue, some of it's lack of moral imagination, some of it's just, as you said, the isolation and the despair that people often feel. And so as we wind down, we only have a few minutes left, I'm wondering, Russ, if you would share something about his empathy in a very amusing human way. This is in other words, we've seen Ellsberg, the great thinker, the great activist, the great history changer. But a lot of that boils down to really being a human being and having empathy, as Kari was pointing out, for others. And so lest you think, he was this amazing person, which he was, but that it starts again with human empathy, I think, one for each other, as Kari was pointing out also.
Well, Linda's been watching. You'll hear me back there.
Yeah, but we need to bring the mic.
I need the mic. So, I'm trying to avoid the mic. So you can hear me back there. I'm just going to talk like a normal person. All right.
The only problem is with that, it's nice to be able to have it recorded.
I see, okay.
To share.
Well, after I've taught at the school for 50 years, I'll probably get this down. Linda's wanted me to tell you this about Ellsberg, but this is actually how I think of Daniel Ellsberg. When I started writing my book on Vietnam, which took me about 20 years, when I started to do it, I had a friend in Washington who invited me to dinner with Ellsberg to just talk about this project. And so the friend, it was a dad, my friend Kai, and his son. And there was also another dad with his son. So there was like two 11-year-old boys, Daniel, me, and the two dads. So one of the things that Daniel Ellsberg was very well known for is that he was like a great magician. He specialized, he did magic tricks for people all the time. So the dad of the visiting dad and his 11-year-old, the dad had obviously prepared his son to show Daniel his magic tricks. And it started, so the dad said, "Come on now, remember, weren't you going to show Daniel your magic tricks?" And the kid is frozen, right? He's not ready to show Daniel Ellsberg his magic tricks. And it's kind of excruciating, the dad can't let it go, and the kid is freezing. And I watched Daniel Ellsberg sitting at this dinner, taking in the plight of this boy and the craziness of the dad. And he couldn't stand it. He just had to intervene. So he immediately just got us out of that horrible situation. He burst right in, and he said something which I don't even truthfully remember, but the point of it was to get the kid off the hook, but not to criticize the dad, like just turn everything into a joke. And that's, exactly what happened. So Ellsberg intervened. The dad finally stopped. The kid relaxed. He probably even would have done the magic tricks at that point. But that's how I think of Daniel Ellsberg, really. It is how I think about him. As a guy who couldn't stand watching an 11-year-old boy be put in a horrible position. That's how I will always remember him. And I think it's a metaphor for how he lived his life.
Couldn't imagine a better ending.